This is one of those revenge stories revolving around the theme of family drama. The end of the story will bring you a big surprise and unforgettable emotions. If you like these stories of injustice and unexpected reversals, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any interesting videos. They say grief reveals character, but I didn't expect it to reveal the worst in mine. My husband had just died. I was still wearing the hospital bracelet when the call came in. It was my aunt voice chipper, as if we hadn't just buried a man who made dinosaur pancakes every Saturday. "Hey, Liv, do you think your side will still want the salmon for Julia's wedding? Or should we switch to chicken?" I remember staring at the phone, not even angry, just numb. That was the moment I realized that sometimes the people closest to you aren't your family. And what came next was far worse than an insult over a menu. Before delving into this story full of betrayal and survival, let me know where you're watching from, and hit like if you've ever felt abandoned at your most vulnerable. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday. I remember waking up to the sound of rain tapping against the bedroom window, the kind of soft, steady drizzle that made you want to pull the covers back over your head. But Kevin was already up. I could hear him in the kitchen humming some old Springsteen tune as he made breakfast. When I walked in, he was flipping pancakes into ridiculous shapes, dinosaurs as usual for our daughter Emily. She giggled from her seat at the counter. "Daddy, that one looks like it has 2 heads. He looked over at me and winked. "That's a brontosaurus after tax season," he joked, covered in flour. If I had known that would be the last morning we'd ever share, I would have held him a little longer. I told him I loved him twice. But life doesn't send warnings, only aftershocks. By 11:12 a.m., I was in a hospital hallway, the scent of antiseptic clinging to my throat. A nurse with kind eyes was saying something I couldn't process, something about a massive cardiac event and efforts made and time of death. I couldn't move. I couldn't cry. I just stared at the silver wedding band still on his hand, still warm when I held it between mine. When I called my parents, I could barely speak. I expected silence, maybe even urgency. Instead, I heard music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. "Oh, honey, my mother said we're just sitting down for Julia's rehearsal dinner. Can we talk later?" I told her Kevin was dead. Gone. Just like that. There was a pause long enough for me to hope she'd finally understood before she whispered, "That's horrible. But sweetheart, you know how important this weekend is for Julia." They'd always favored Julia. Pretty charming, perfect Julia. The one who got straight A's without trying. The one who danced ballet while I washed dishes. Even as a kid, I was the invisible cousin. I thought maybe adulthood would level the field. It turns out that adulthood hands the golden child a bigger stage. That night, Emily crawled into my bed, clutching Kevin's old flannel shirt. I watched her chest rise and fall, still too young to understand what forever meant. I sat on the floor of our dark bathroom, the cool tiles grounding me as I let grief crack me open in silence. I wanted to scream. Instead, I planned funeral arrangements on my phone while Julia posted photos of her welcome party on Instagram. She wore white. I wore black. The world kept turning, and the next morning it got even uglier. Because of what my family said during the funeral, that was when I realized just how alone I truly was. The funeral home had 1 slot open Saturday morning at 10. That's when Kevin would be laid to rest. I didn't even hesitate. I just said yes. But within minutes of notifying my parents, the backlash began. "You chose Saturday," my mother asked, as if I'd announced we were hosting a barbecue. "That's Julia's wedding day, Olivia. Half the family won't be able to attend, including us." The words didn't hit all at once. They sank in slowly like ice through the water. I reminded her calmly somehow that Kevin had no family left but me and Emily. That his parents had passed. That his friends were flying in from across the country. That it was his only chance to be honored. That I was drowning. "Then maybe you should consider rescheduling," she replied. "We just can't abandon Julia on her big day." Julia didn't call. Not once. But she did post on Facebook, so excited for the wedding tomorrow. Blessed beyond measure. There were photos of champagne glasses clinking as well as centerpieces in mauve and gold. One image showed her beaming beside my father, both laughing beneath a floral arch, while I was choosing between cremation and casket. On the day of Kevin's funeral, I stood in black beside my daughter as she clutched a folded paper heart she'd made for him. The chapel was half empty. The pews where my family should have been were instead occupied by Kevin's college friends, my neighbors, and the woman from the dry cleaners who'd hugged me without saying a word when I dropped off his suit. After the service, while Emily and I placed lilies on Kevin's casket, my phone buzzed. A message from my cousin Ashley Hope today went okay. Julia looked stunning. The ceremony was a dream. There was even a selfie attached, her smile wide as if it were spring break. It felt like a joke the universe had scripted just for me, a test of whether I could grieve quietly enough not to interrupt someone else's celebration. That night I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, wondering how people could be so quick to compartmentalize their thoughts. Joy in one room, heartbreak in another. And somehow the heartbreak always seemed to belong to me. I thought that would be the worst of it. However, it was followed by an email from my parents. The subject line read, "Financial concerns, reshared vendors." And what they said inside, what they asked of me next, shattered whatever was left of my faith in blood. The email began politely enough. "Dear Olivia, we hope you're finding moments of peace during this difficult time." And then came the real message. A request to reimburse a portion of the flower arrangements, since, as they put it, both events used the same vendor, and it only seems fair to split the cost. Kevin's funeral, Julia's wedding, one florist, one family, no soul. I stared at the screen, not knowing whether to laugh or throw the laptop across the room. I called my mother, my hands trembling, not with grief this time, but disbelief. "Mom," I said, my voice flat. "Did you expect me to pay for centerpieces at a wedding I wasn't even invited to?" She sighed like I was making her life harder. "Honey, you're being dramatic. It's not about the flowers. It's about fairness. We all had to adjust plans. I buried my husband while you were doing the cha-cha slide." "I'm not paying a dime," I said quietly. There was a pause, followed by the sentence that always seemed to follow me in this family. "You're overreacting, Olivia. I've heard that phrase since I was a little girl, when I cried because Julia got the bigger Christmas gift. When I stood on stage in 5th grade alone because no one from my family came to the talent show. When I didn't get into the college I dreamed of Julia breezed in a year later with a full ride and a party to match. You're too sensitive. You always take things personally. You twist everything. Each time I tried to stand up for myself, they made it about my attitude. I grew up learning how to blend in, to disappear in plain sight. But something about losing Kevin changed that. Maybe it was because he saw me for who I was. He never told me to be quieter or smaller. He told me I was powerful. And suddenly their words didn't land the same. Your overreacting sounded less like fact and more like control. I told my mother I wouldn't be attending any more family gatherings. I said it without apology. Then I hung up. 2 hours later, my cousin sent me a screenshot of a group chat. Julia had written leaves having another meltdown. Typical. A laughing emoji followed. That was the moment I realized they didn't just lack compassion. They enjoyed my pain. But they weren't done yet. Not even close. Next came the custody conversation, and the twisted plan they had for my daughter. After the group chat leak, something in me cracked open. Not the kind of break that shatters, but the kind that finally lets light in. I spent the next night digging through an old box in the attic looking for proof that my childhood wasn't all imagined neglect. What I found wasn't comforting. It was confirming. My 6th birthday party, for example. I remember it so vividly because it never happened. That year, Julia had the flu. Not hospitalized, not contagious. Just tired. And so my birthday was postponed indefinitely. My cake never picked up. The balloons never blown. I remember staring out the window waiting for a car that never came. My mom said, "Sweetheart, it's just a party. You'll have others." But I didn't. Or the Christmas when I unwrapped a secondhand jacket while Julia squealed over a brand new iPhone. Olivia, be grateful my dad scolded. Not everyone gets gifts at all. But Julia always did new shiny and celebrated. The erasure wasn't just emotional. It was physical. In every family photo, Julia stood front and center, arms around my parents. I was the blur in the corner, the afterthought. My presence was tolerated, not treasured. I brought this up once gently during a holiday dinner years ago. Why am I not in the Disney World album? I asked, half laughing. My mom blinked, then shrugged. Oh, that was the year you stayed behind with Aunt Carol. You were sick or something. But I wasn't. I was 12. And they told me the trip was just too expensive this time. A week later, I saw the photos online, my whole family, including cousins, all smiling with Mickey Mouse. I told myself back then that maybe I'd misunderstood, that perhaps they loved differently. But now, as an adult, it was impossible to unsee. Even my graduation. I walked across the stage in a too-big gown, scanning the crowd. Julia had flown back from college for the weekend. She stood in the front row recording herself for Instagram. My parents waved at her. Kevin had noticed. He squeezed my hand after the ceremony and said, "You deserve more than they've ever given you. But I see you live. I always will." That memory saved me now. Because when my parents called for a meeting to discuss Emily's future, I knew exactly what they meant. And I knew this wasn't just about old wounds anymore. They wanted my daughter. And they were about to use my grief as an excuse. I picked Emily up from school the day Kevin died, and she skipped toward the car like it was any other Tuesday. Her backpack bounced against her tiny shoulders, and her smile. God, that smile was so full of light, I wanted to bottle it. Please keep it safe. Keep her safe. She climbed into the back seat and said, "Daddy's coming to my art show tonight, right?" He promised. He even packed my markers this morning so I could touch up my volcano painting. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't answer. I couldn't, not yet. I pulled over at the quiet end of Sycamore Drive, where the trees curved overhead like sheltering arms. The engine clicked as it cooled, and I turned around to face her. "Sweetheart," I said, my voice softer than I thought it could be. "Something unfortunate happened today." Her head tilted. She was so used to joy, so unfamiliar with sorrow. "Daddy got very sick while he was at work," I continued, "and the doctors, they couldn't help him." She frowned. "Is he in the hospital? Can we go visit?" I shook my head, and that's when the tremble started in her lip. "Emily. Daddy died today." Silence. The kind that screams. She blinked at me, confusion turning to horror, her hands gripping the straps of her backpack. "But he promised." "I know, baby," I whispered, holding out my arms. "I know." And then she wailed, a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a cry, it was a rupture, raw and desperate and not meant for a child. She buried her face in my chest, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. We stayed there like that until the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of ash. That night she refused to sleep in her room. I tucked her into our bed, placed Kevin's old flannel shirt in her arms, and told her stories. How he once danced in the grocery store to make her laugh, how he called her Peanut, and never missed a single bedtime story. She eventually fell asleep, her small hand wrapped around the fabric like a lifeline. I lay beside her, eyes wide open, trying to remember how to breathe without Kevin. And while the world outside kept turning, something inside me shifted. Because just as I closed my eyes, my phone lit up with a new message. It was from my parents. They wanted to come over the next day, not to comfort me, not to check on Emily, but to discuss custody options. And just like that, the next battle began. The call came at 8:43 a.m., just as I was pouring Emily's cereal. She was humming to herself, still clutching Kevin's shirt like it held the last trace of him. I answered without checking the ID. "I should have known." "Olivia," my mother began, her voice strangely formal. "Your father and I were hoping to stop by later this afternoon." I paused. "To check on Emily." There was a beat too long before she answered. Yes, of course. And to talk about some things, practical matters. I felt it coming like a slow-moving avalanche. What kind of matters? She cleared her throat. Well, we've been discussing Emily's future, stability, routine. Kevin was her foundation and you're grieving naturally. It's a lot for one person. There it was. You think I'm unfit. My voice was calm, dangerously so. Don't twist this, Olivia, she said, slipping into that familiar tone. Condescending, concerned, rehearsed. We're just thinking of what's best for her. Julia and Thomas have a big house, a backyard, dual incomes, no emotional instability right now. I almost dropped the phone. Julia. You're suggesting Julia and her husband raise my daughter? She's family live. My mom continued. And she's willing. That says a lot. Maybe she could offer Emily a more normal environment while you get back on your feet. I couldn't breathe. Not because of the insult, but because of the arrogance. The assumption that grief made me less. That being a widow made me weak. That my daughter was theirs to rearrange like furniture during a remodel. I'm not sending my child to live with someone who missed her father's funeral, I snapped. There was silence. Then, as if rehearsed, she said it. You're overreacting. That phrase again. Like a reflex. Like a tool. I'll be home all day, I said, but if you're coming to suggest custody, bring a lawyer. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From fury. Emily looked up from her cereal concern on her little face. Was that Grandma? Yeah? I said, managing a smile. But don't worry. Mommy's got this. I stood taller that day. Grief still clung to my bones, but something more substantial was beginning to take root resolve. And I had no idea yet that Kevin had left something behind. A letter. A warning. And the key to everything that was about to come next. It was just after noon when I heard the knock on the door. I opened it to find Kevin's parents, Frank and Marlene, standing there, with a car full of groceries and overnight bag, and that look only people who have known real loss carry in their eyes. They had driven 6 hours without calling ahead. We figured you'd say not to fuss, Marlene said, holding out a warm casserole dish like it was armor against the chaos. I broke down in the doorway. They didn't talk much at first. They just moved through the house like people who knew what to do: laundry, dishes, folding blankets, refilling the bird feeder Kevin had always kept stocked for Emily's morning window routine. And then that night, after Emily had finally drifted to sleep between us, Marlene sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You don't have to fight alone." That sentence cracked something open in me, because for the first time since Kevin died, someone wasn't telling me to calm down, or move on, or stop making drama. They were showing up. Quietly, consistently. Frank built Emily a shadow box for Kevin's funeral flag. Marlene taught her how to cook banana bread from scratch the way Kevin had loved it. They even helped her write a little goodbye letter to tuck inside his casket. I hadn't thought of that. I was too busy just trying to catch my breath. At one point, I caught Marlene looking through one of Kevin's old photo albums, her finger tracing his younger face. "I used to worry he'd never find someone who saw him," she whispered. "Then you showed up." She smiled at me like I was still worth something even now shattered, and the contrast hit me like a freight train. My parents were strategizing how to remove my daughter. These two, bound to me only by marriage and memory, were holding me together with casseroles and silence. The next day, as they packed up to leave, Marlene hugged me tight. "If they push you," she said, "you push back. You're a mother. That matters more than their money or their opinions." Then Frank handed me something, a thick envelope. "We found this in Kevin's desk," he said. "It's addressed to you." Inside was Kevin's handwriting, and what he had written. It would change everything I thought I knew about what he left behind. 3 days after Kevin's funeral, I found the envelope in my mailbox, thin, white, and too neat to be threatening. For a second, I thought it was another sympathy card. Maybe a belated one. People often don't know what to say, but sometimes they send flowers or notes anyway. But this wasn't that. It was an invoice. Typed. Formal. And from my cousin Julia's wedding planner. Shared vendor charges florals transport linen rentals. Olivia Morgan amount due $2, 184.32. At first I thought it was a mistake, some administrative mix-up. I called the number listed, still giving the world the benefit of the doubt. "Oh yes," the planner chirped, "your mother asked me to forward this. Since both events used the same vendors, she felt it would be fair to split the costs." I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but no words came, just air. I hung up, went inside, and stared at the invoice again. If I blinked enough, it would turn into something else. Something less cruel. They'd buried their son-in-law, skipped the funeral, and now they were billing me for linens. I called my mother, but it went straight to voicemail. So I called Julia. She answered on the second ring, her voice chipper. "Hey, Liv. Did you get the invoice? Mom thought it would be less awkward if it came from the planner directly." "Awkward," I said. My voice didn't even sound like mine. "Well, you did use the same florist, and technically the shuttle bus made a stop at the chapel too, right? We just figured." "You figured I'd be too broken to argue," I cut in. "You figured wrong." She laughed. "Oh, Olivia, you've always taken things so seriously. It's just logistics." "No, Julia. It was your wedding. It was my husband's funeral. But sure, let's call it logistics." I didn't argue further. I said, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," and ended the call. I didn't have a lawyer, not yet, but that was the moment I knew I'd get one, not just for the invoice, but for everything. Because that envelope was never just about money. It was a declaration. A message. They didn't just want to exclude me. They wanted to erase me. And what Kevin had written in that letter I found the day before. It was the one thing that proved I still mattered, more than any of them could ever understand. And I hadn't even opened it yet. It started like any other evening. Dishes in the sink. Emily drawing quietly on the living room rug. Kevin's old hoodie draped over the couch as if he'd just stepped out. I wasn't looking for pain. I wasn't even scrolling. But then I got the tag. A Julia Morgan official just posted new wedding photos. The notification chirped, cheerful and oblivious. I clicked. The first picture was what you'd expect: Julia and Thomas, all teeth and white lace, posed under an arch of hydrangeas. The caption read, "The happiest day of our lives. Bittersweet but beautiful." Bittersweet, I swiped again. And there it was. A photo taken at the hill above St. Andrew's Cemetery. Kevin's grave was just out of frame, but I recognized the slope, the tree line, and the very spot where we had stood while Emily said goodbye. Julia stood there, clutching her bouquet, her dress fanned out over the grass, one hand on her hip, beaming. I blinked, swiped again. The following photo was a wide shot. Kevin's headstone was now in full view, blurred, yes, but unmistakable. The top of the marker caught the afternoon light, casting a soft glow. You could even see the lilies Marlene and I had placed 2 days earlier, now kicked aside by a careless heel. The caption, "Sometimes beauty and pain share the same space. Stader, life goes on." My stomach turned. Not a single mention of Kevin. Not a word of apology. Just hashtags and curated grief. Aesthetic mourning for likes. I stood up so quickly my chair screeched across the tile. Emily looked up. "Mommy, I'm okay." I lied, but my hands were shaking. I screenshotted every photo, every comment, every heart emoji. Then I picked up my phone and called Julia. She didn't answer. I tried my mother next. She did. "Mom, I said you let her take wedding photos at Kevin's grave." There was a pause. Then, as if I was being unreasonable, "Oh, Olivia, it wasn't on the grave, and the lighting was beautiful. Julia had already booked the photographer and, well, we didn't think you'd care." I didn't think I'd care. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Later that night, I opened Kevin's letter. I needed something, anything that reminded me I wasn't insane for feeling this much, for hurting this deeply. What did I find inside? It wasn't just a love letter. It was a plan, a warning, and the first clue that Kevin knew what my family was capable of long before I did. Kevin's handwriting was always steady, like he measured each word before letting it leave the pen. The envelope had been sealed with a single strip of tape bearing our names in black ink. I waited until Emily was asleep before opening it. Inside were 2 documents, a handwritten letter and an updated will signed and notarized just 4 months before the accident. The letter was short. Just a few lines about Liv. If you're reading this, it means the unthinkable happened. I pray you're safe, that Emily is okay. I know your family and I'm familiar with how they operate. This will isn't just about money, it's protection. I trust you. Only you. My hands trembled as I unfolded the legal document. Kevin had left everything to me, his pension savings, the house. But what made me stop breathing was the clause labeled custodial guardianship contingency. It read, "In the event of my death, sole custody of our daughter Emily shall remain with Olivia Morgan. In the event Olivia is incapacitated or deemed unfit by third parties, not bound by the court, temporary guardianship shall be transferred to Frank and Marlene Bennett, parents of the deceased, until Olivia is deemed fit. Under no circumstances is custody to be granted to the family of Olivia Morgan." I read that last line 5 times. Kevin had anticipated this. He knew. The next day I had the will certified by my attorney. Yes, I finally hired one, and then I waited, because I knew my parents weren't finished. Their tone had changed, too polite, too cautious. They were circling. The final straw came at a family lunch I didn't agree to arrange under the guise of just talking things out. I brought Emily with me to avoid the optics of secrecy. My mother, lips tight, offered lemonade like we were neighbors chatting over gardening. Then she slid a manila folder across the table. "We've prepared an emergency guardianship agreement, just in case. We thought it would make things easier if anything happened to you." I didn't even open it. I just smiled, reached into my purse and pulled out Kevin's will. "This," I said, placing it firmly on the table, "is what will happen if anything happens to me." "Not that." My father paled. Julia, who had come for moral support, choked on her iced tea. I leaned in. "You underestimated me. Again." But the look in Julia's eyes told me something else was brewing. Something worse than paperwork. Because her ego had just been bruised in front of the whole room. And bruised egos in this family. They strike back. Hard. The worst part wasn't that they wanted custody. It was that they wanted it. It was that they thought I'd hand Emily over without a fight. The day after I revealed Kevin's will, my parents showed up unannounced. I watched from the kitchen window as they climbed out of their SUV, my mother holding a thick binder, as if it were a weapon. My father adjusted his tie, yes, a tie to a house visit, as if trying to look official. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I opened the door before they could knock. "Let's not do this," I said flatly. "Olivia," my mother said, lips pursed. "We're just here to talk. This isn't an attack." Then she added the sentence that made my blood run cold. "You've been under a lot of strain. Everyone sees it. I didn't invite them in." I stood with the door open, letting the wind speak for me. My father stepped forward. "We've spoken to a family counselor, someone who specializes in transitional care. Julia and Thomas are willing to open their home to you, just temporarily. She has a room there," my mother added quickly. "They've even painted it lavender, Emily's favorite. They'd painted a room for my daughter, without asking, without being asked." I crossed my arms. "Let me be clear. Emily is not moving into anyone's lavender-painted room. Not for a week, not for a day. You're being defensive." My mother sighed as if she were explaining taxes to a child. "We're trying to help." "No," I said. "You're trying to win. And you're using my daughter to do it." Then my father said it, what they'd been building up to all along. "If it comes to a hearing," he said, "we'll testify that your mental state is unstable, that you've made concerning decisions, that Emily would benefit from structure." He said it as if he were doing me a favor, as if this was just paperwork and calm reasoning. My body went still. Not cold. Not numb, still like before a storm breaks. I suggest I said slowly, "You leave now." They looked at each other, realizing too late that the woman they used to bulldoze had vanished the day Kevin died. "I'm not the grieving girl you're used to manipulating," I added. "I'm a mother now. And if you come for my daughter again, you'll meet me in court." I closed the door without another word. Inside, Emily was at the table, coloring quietly. She looked up. "Grandma left already?" "Yep," I said, kissing her head. She forgot what family means, but I hadn't, and neither had Kevin, because hidden in his will was one more clause, one that would bring the fight to a whole new level. The first time I walked into my lawyer's office, I felt like an imposter in my own life. Me, Olivia Morgan, former PTA mom, carpool scheduler, grocery list queen, now flipping through custody codes and legal defenses like I was on some courtroom drama. But this was real. My attorney Janice was sharp mid-50s with eyes like steel, and the kind of voice that made judges lean forward. I handed her Kevin's will and the folder my parents had left behind. She didn't flinch. Just opened both, scanned them, and said, "They thought this would intimidate you." I smiled. They've underestimated me since I was 6. Janice set aside their folder with a flick of her fingers, then picked up Kevin's. She pulled out the documents I'd seen and one I hadn't. A thin folded page tucked between 2 notarized sheets. My breath caught. "What's that?" I asked. She handed it to me. "Looks like your husband left you more than instructions." I unfolded the page, heart racing. It was Kevin's handwriting again, but this time it was informal. It was scribbled, rushed, dated 2 weeks before his accident. "Live. If anything ever happens to me, check the green binder in my home office, the back shelf behind the tax folders. Don't trust your parents. I overheard something at Christmas. Your mom was talking to Julia about rescuing Emily. You said I was too emotional, too unstable. They said they'd take her if they had to. I didn't want to upset you, so I didn't bring it up then. But I knew they'd come. Protect our girl. Use this binder. I've documented everything. Love you forever." I froze. Christmas. That gathering where my mother kept refilling Julia's wine glass and asked me casually if I'd considered therapy for my mood swings. At the time, I thought it was just another jab. Kevin had known. He hadn't said a word, but he had prepared. Quietly, methodically. When I got home, I went straight to his office. I had never touched his shelf before. It still smelled like him. I pulled the green binder out from behind the tax folders. Inside were printouts, emails, screenshots, bank statements, even a voice memo from the night of that Christmas conversation where my mother could be heard saying, "If Olivia slips just once, we'll have everything we need." Kevin had recorded her. The binder wasn't just defense, it was ammunition. And with Janice guiding me, I wasn't just playing defense anymore. We were going on the offensive. Because what my parents didn't know was I had receipts. And very soon, so would the court. The email came at 7:18 a.m., right as I was pouring coffee. The subject line was simple custody filing, formal notice. My hand froze mid-pour, the smell of burnt drip suddenly too sharp. I clicked. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was real. They had filed an emergency petition for temporary custody of Emily, citing emotional instability, unsafe grieving behaviors, and evidence of coercion. They listed Julia and Thomas as proposed guardians again. They called me unfit, said I was neglecting the child's emotional needs, that I had refused reasonable support from family. They attached photos, one of Emily sleeping on the couch, another of dishes in my sink, and the worst, a screenshot of a private grief group I joined online. It felt like a slap, not just because it was cruel, but because they had planned it, gathered evidence, built a case behind my back. I called Janice. she answered on the first ring. They just filed, she said calmly. We've got this. But I didn't feel calm. I felt gutted, violated, because these were my parents. I used to think parents were supposed to protect you, especially in your weakest moments. Mine were weaponizing mine, and they were smiling while they did it. That afternoon, I dropped Emily off at school, just as if it were a typical day. She kissed my forehead. I smoothed her hair. I pretended I wasn't about to spend the next few hours in a lawyer's office, reviewing affidavits, phone logs, and voice memos like I was on trial for breathing. Janice was unshakable. She printed Kevin's will and highlighted the guardianship clause. Then she opened the green binder and said, "We're not just defending Olivia. We're counterfiling. We drafted a protective order. We prepared our custody motion 1 that included Kevin's recordings, the screenshots of Julia's wedding photos at his grave, and a letter from Emily's school counselor verifying that she was safe, supported, and thriving at home. But what hit me the hardest was what Emily said. When I told her carefully that Grandma and Grandpa might be trying something. She looked up from her coloring book and said, "Are they mad because Daddy picked you and not them?" I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't. "No, sweetheart," I said. "They're mad because I'm not afraid of them anymore." And I wasn't. Because the court wasn't the end. It was just the next step. And what happened in that courtroom changed everything. Not just for me, but for Emily too. There's a look people give you when you're grieving and not performing it the way they expect. It's somewhere between pity and suspicion. Like they're waiting for you to drop your grocery bag in public and scream. It's like they want it to confirm something. I saw that look on my mother's face when she told the court I was unstable. "She isolates herself," she said, voice dripping with concern. "She hasn't smiled in weeks. She's withdrawn. She talks to her late husband's photo in front of the child." I did. I do. Sometimes I whisper goodnights to Kevin's picture. Sometimes I cry while folding his laundry still tucked in a drawer I can't bring myself to empty. But that isn't wild. It's grief. The judge asked me directly, "Ms. Morgan, are you emotionally capable of caring for your daughter right now?" I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said. "I'm grieving, but I'm not broken." Then I handed the court a letter. It was from Emily's school counselor, Miss Grant. In it, she wrote, "Emily speaks lovingly of her mother. She feels safe and supported and is performing at or above grade level. Olivia Morgan attends every parent meeting and checks in regularly. If this is what grief looks like, it's also what resilience looks like." That moment reading Miss Grant's words aloud was like watching sunlight slice through a fog I'd been trapped in for months. Because for the first time, someone said out loud what I had felt all along. I wasn't spiraling. I was surviving. Janice followed up with a stack of photos. Emily and I baking, drawing chalk rainbows on the driveway, asleep together on the couch books in our laps. Then she played the voice memo from the Christmas conversation Kevin recorded, the one where my mother said, "If Olivia slips just once." The courtroom was silent. My father shifted in his seat. Julia glared, arms crossed. My mother didn't blink, but her knuckles whitened against the bench. And the judge. She cleared her throat and said, "I've seen enough." She looked me in the eye. "Ms. Morgan, grief is not instability. You are capable, and more importantly, you are devoted. This court sees no reason to interfere with your custodial rights." I didn't cry. Not then. But when we walked outside and Emily reached for my hand and said, "Told you we'd be okay," I almost collapsed under the weight of that relief. And yet, just when I thought the battle was over, the judge added one more sentence. "There's still the matter of the countersuit," she said. Because now, it was my turn. They say children don't belong in courtrooms, that it's too heavy, too complicated. But sometimes the truth needs to come from the smallest voice in the room. Emily was 8, and braver than most adults I knew. We hadn't planned on letting her speak. Janice and I agreed it was too much too soon. But the judge asked a final question, one that changed everything. Is there anything Emily herself would like to say before I make my ruling? My heart stopped. I looked at Emily sitting beside me, coloring a sun with thick yellow crayon lines. She looked up calm, like she'd been waiting. I want to, she said quietly. The courtroom hushed. The bailiff brought a chair to the front, just beneath the judge's bench. Emily climbed into it with the seriousness of someone twice her age. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink. She just spoke. My daddy died, she began. And since then, people have been deafening. Not with yelling, but with pretending. My parents shifted in their seats. My mommy cries sometimes, she said, but she still makes me pancakes and brushes my hair and helps with spelling. She lets me talk about daddy whenever I want. No one else does that. Not Grandma. Not Aunt Julia. Julia scoffed under her breath. The judge shot her a look that could have frozen a wildfire. Emily wasn't done. I don't want to live in a big house with people who don't talk about daddy. I want to live with Mommy. She listens. And then she added so simply it pierced the air. Mommy is the only one who didn't leave me. Silence again. The kind that wraps around your ribs. I felt tears slide down my cheek, but I didn't wipe them. I let them stay. Let them witness her truth. The judge leaned forward. Thank you, Emily. That was very brave. And just like that, the tension in the room broke. Janice placed her hand gently on my arm. I heard a whisper from behind me. Someone in the gallery murmuring, "That little girl just sealed it." And she had. Because no document, no affidavit, no polished lie could compete with the pure clarity of a child who had lost everything and still told the truth. But while the courtroom leaned toward justice, my parents leaned toward something else entirely. Retaliation. And I didn't know it yet. But Julia Wounded Exposed was already working on her next move. One that would test every ounce of strength I had left. The judge didn't flinch. She didn't lean back or pause dramatically like in movies. She just looked down at her notes, lifted her gaze, and spoke with calm, unshakable clarity. This court sees no evidence of parental unfitness, she said, voice firm. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied in full. My breath caught in my throat. Then came the next blow, one aimed not at me, but at them. In fact, she continued, due to the nature of the allegations and the evidence submitted, this court is granting a 12-month no-contact order for Mr. and Mrs. Morgan and Ms. Julia Thomas regarding the minor child, Emily Morgan. A ripple spread through the courtroom. Even Janice, composed as ever, blinked in surprise. My mother gasped softly. Julia's jaw dropped. My father muttered something under his breath, something that sounded a lot like unbelievable. But it was believable. It was earned. The judge wasn't done. This family dynamic, she said, glancing toward my parents' table, shows a pattern of manipulation, boundary violations, and attempts to override a legally binding will. The court views that as not just inappropriate, but dangerous. I felt warmth spread across my chest. Not victory. Not yet. But validation. For the first time since Kevin's death, someone with power had looked at me and seen the truth. Emily squeezed my hand under the table. She didn't understand every word, but she felt it. The shift. The relief. After the court adjourned, we walked into the hallway, stepping into a different world. The weight I'd carried for months, years, really began to lift. Not all at once, but inch by inch. Janice turned to me and said, "That wasn't just a win. That was a line in the sand." I nodded. And they can't cross it anymore. But deep down I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of the story, because in her final act of desperation, Julia had already taken steps to retaliate. It wasn't through court this time. It was through something far more public. And the next chapter wouldn't take place in a courtroom, but online. Where truth gets buried in likes and lies, where lipstick and filters. And this time, it wouldn't be just my name on the line. It would be my reputation, my job, my ability to stand tall in a world that already wanted me quiet. It started with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, is this Olivia Morgan?" the woman asked. "I'm calling from the Whitmore Children's Foundation." I paused, unsure. "Yes, that's me. I just wanted to thank you for the recent contribution personally. It was significant, and we're truly honored to put it toward our scholarship housing program." I blinked. I didn't donate. There was a pause on the other end. Then she read the note attached to the wire transfer, in memory of Kevin Morgan. For every child who was overlooked, underestimated, or unheard, let them know someone believed in them. My throat tightened. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, clutching the phone like it held his voice. Kevin had set up the donation months before he died, quietly, without fanfare. He'd never told me. It wasn't in his will, it wasn't in the binder, but there it was, $25,000 sent to a nonprofit that housed foster kids aging out of the system. He hadn't just protected Emily. He had made sure that other children, the forgotten ones like me once, would have a shot. I asked the foundation director if I could visit the house. A week later, I stood in a small community kitchen painted bright yellow, where 4 teenage girls were laughing over burnt spaghetti and Taylor Swift playing from someone's phone. One of the girls noticed me tearing up and handed me a box of tissues. "You okay, ma'am?" she asked, not unkind. I nodded. My husband helped build this. He'd have loved this energy. She smiled and said, "Then he must have been good people?" Kevin wasn't perfect. He couldn't fix my childhood or undo my parents' cruelty. But he knew what it meant to feel invisible. And he did everything he could to make sure Emily and now others would never feel that way. That night I wrote him a letter, just 1 page. "You were always looking ahead. I was always just trying to survive. But somehow between the pain and the noise you made room for legacy, for impact, for good. I hope you know I saw you, just like you saw me." I folded the letter and tucked it into the old flannel shirt Emily still kept under her pillow. I thought that would be the quiet end to our storm, but it wasn't. Because Julia wasn't done. And the next move she made, it went viral. We moved in late spring, when the cherry blossoms were still in bloom, and the air smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. The townhouse wasn't big, but it had a tiny backyard where Emily planted sunflowers and neighbors who waved without needing an explanation. We weren't running away, we were starting over. Kevin's parents helped us unpack. Marlene hung wind chimes on the porch. Frank installed a mailbox shaped like a little red barn. "You need a little whimsy," he said, handing me a cup of coffee, like a peace treaty from a world that had forgotten to be kind. Our landlord, a retired librarian, would often bake banana bread for new tenants. The woman across the street was also a widow, and we would have coffee every Thursday with no small talk, just quiet understanding. None of them shared my DNA, but every one of them felt more like family than the people who'd raised me. Emily bloomed. Her nightmares faded. She laughed more. I started writing little stories about a superhero named Mama Lightning. She once told her teacher that we were a team like peanut butter and jelly, but braver. It was a life that didn't need approval from anyone who thought they had a right to us. But then, Julia struck. It began with a post, a carefully curated video montage. Her wedding clips spliced with black and white photos of Kevin and Emily, set to dramatic piano music. The caption read, "When love becomes complicated, and family betrays you. My truth. My story." She'd used old footage, some from holidays, some she'd stolen from my private social media. She painted herself as the victim, the caring cousin who had only ever tried to rescue Emily from an unstable, bitter mother. And she tagged me. Overnight, the comments exploded. People I didn't know called me a narcissist, a liar. One woman even said I should have my child taken away just for spite. The video went viral. It wasn't kind. It was manipulative, calculated. But this time, I wasn't alone. Kevin's parents issued a public statement. My neighbors commented in defense. Even Emily's school posted a message about the unwavering strength of one of our parents. And I didn't react, not yet. Because if Julia wanted a public reckoning, I was ready. She lit the match. But I'd already built the firebreak. And in the final chapter, she would learn what it means to underestimate a woman who's lost everything, except her voice. I didn't fight Julia online. I didn't post a rebuttal video. I didn't even comment. Instead, I emailed her attorney. 3 days later, she received a cease and desist order for defamation, privacy violation, and emotional harassment of a minor. Attached were screenshots, school statements, and the original footage she'd taken without consent. Her post disappeared within the hour. And just like that, the fire fizzled. Not because I screamed louder, but because I finally knew I didn't have to prove my worth to people committed to denying it. What they wanted. My silence. My surrender. My daughter was never theirs to claim, and now they had nothing left to take. Emily and I settled into the rhythm of normal. Not perfect, but real. Saturday morning pancakes, after-school art projects, Kevin's flannel still draped over the back of her desk chair, like a quiet protector. I started writing again. Just little pieces at first. Blog posts, short essays. I wrote about grief, about motherhood, about what it means to rebuild when the ground beneath you has given way. One of those essays got picked up by a women's publication. The editor called it fiercely soft. I liked that. Because strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it folds laundry, helps with spelling, and chooses not to fight fire with fire. Sometimes it just keeps showing up. Kevin once told me legacy isn't what you leave in your will. It's what people remember about how you made them feel. He was right. My real inheritance wasn't a House A trust or a title. It was knowing how to stay standing when the people who should lift you try to knock you down. It was learning that family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shares your battles. It was the daughter who now calls me her hero. And the quiet understanding that I am not broken. Not bitter. Not alone. Just rebuilt. Piece by piece. In love, in truth, and in full view of anyone who ever doubted me. Last week, Emily planted her first tree in our backyard. A dogwood. Her hands were covered in soil, her face flushed with joy. "This is so it always remembers where it started," she said. I stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other holding a watering can. And I thought, yes. Let it be remembered. Let all of this be remembered. The loss? The fight? The rising? Because some legacies aren't about money or monuments. They're about making sure the cycle ends with you. To anyone still fighting to be seen, keep going. You're not invisible. You're just not done yet. Subscribe to catch more inspiring stories. We're just getting started.